Hey everybody, Portland Chess Shop here to bring you another bullet commentary, and we have Grandmaster Cheburator against Tourist. So Tourist is playing again against an esteemed Grandmaster opponent. So let's see if he can win it this time. So we see taking en passant here, the knight takes back, the knight exchanges, the pawn will take back. We see that all these pawns are on dark squares, and this bishop is forced to move after the rook attacks it. And now the bishop's going to be moving again. No, he decides to push the pawn, attacking both the bishop and the knight. I guess that's a pawn sacrifice, so that this pawn can't take back here. The bishop goes over here, and an exchange might be made. So this is a fractured pawn position. 4 pawn islands for purple, and only 3 for white. So here he's thinking about just moving his rook all the way across the board to threaten a checkmate. He does do it. Pawn goes up. So this is pretty good. Now, if the bishop takes, the queen will take. So now we've seen a bishop sacrifice. He's going for a checkmating attack. Let's see if he has it. There's mate. So Tourist takes down. All right, we see a rematch. We see Cheburator against Tourist, and Cheburator decides to go for a early castling, developing his knight, then his bishop, and then castling. And now he's moving his pawns up one at a time, developing his queen. Here comes an exchange, so now we have an open file down here, but doubled pawns as well. Bishop decides to move again, attacking the knight. The pawn moves forward, attacking the bishop, and now we see an exchange. Bishop takes the knight, and then the pawn goes up to attack the bishop. The bishop moves, and now the knight comes out to the corner, but it's going to c4. I think it could have come towards the center. But here the knight moves again, attacking the bishop. The knight moves, attacking the bishop. We want to see a check here. That's part of the idea. Bishop goes all the way back, which is kind of unusual, giving away this check and then taking the pawn. Now the knight takes and the pawn takes, and then the pawn defends after the bishop attacks it. And now g5 is played, attacking, and he just immediately takes it. So pawn up, but now this pawn is going to fall. This king is going to be a little bit vulnerable, but instead the a7 pawn falls, and now there's a check, king over check, king up, and now rooks are exchanged. There's a check, the king comes back, and now he attacks the pawn on b1. This could be favorable for white. I think that this bishop is pinned, which could be good. Check. Now the king is going to be forced to move. And purple decides to resign in this position. We see another game, and Tourist decides to go for the early castling as well. So both players playing sort of a King's Indian setup. The knight decides to retreat after the pawn attacks it, and now we see takes back. We might see pawn up again. No, we see the knight attacked, and then immediately takes here, creating some asymmetries. So this pawn takes back, but then the rook has to move. The knight goes back. We see pretty quick moving game, I think. Like, both players are just making moves pretty fast, not entirely clear, like with this, when this knight got taken and this knight got taken, who it favored, not too easy to tell. So now both the rooks are attacked, which has to favor purple, I would think. Oh no, there's a check, and now still both rooks are attacked, but this rook is taken, so really a lot of pieces just flying all over the board. Decides to attack the bishop, and then he takes the other piece. So we see it ends up equal after all those exchanges. So that's really just shows you, how these master level players are just able to move pieces quickly and keep equality at the same time. I mean, there was some asymmetric changes in that position, but somehow it ended up in a dead equal endgame. The only advantage, I think, is that purple has the king advanced and may be able to take this pawn and move it. See, this king is coming towards this pawn, which could be advantageous. Also, he's up like 17 seconds, which is kind of a huge deal. So the knight comes towards, and now the king is able to take this pawn. Now purple's up a pawn, and not only is it any pawn, it's also a pass pawn. He decides to rearrange his knight. He's going to try to move his knight to so that he could advance this. He might go knight here. No, he decides to go knight here, defending this pawn. Now the knight, he loses the pawn. So the rooks are exchanged. It's still dead equal, but it's 4 seconds against 20 seconds, which is really the big factor. So it's all about how fast you can play in bullet chess. Because, I don't think white could finish this game in 3 seconds, unless he hung the rook, and then maybe he could. But purple's just going to play defense, play solid, and go for the win. Now he even has a little bit of an advantage here. These pawns are a little bit more advanced than his opponents, but not too much. Now the rook is hanging, so he just takes it, and the game is over.
A game of chess is like a sword.
All right, another game has begun, and it is Grandmaster Cheburator against A Gleish. So A Gleish is a heavy underdog. He's down, 300 points in rating points. I'm not sure exactly what that means. Maybe he wins 1 and 8 or something. So here we see a central pawn break. The queen is attacked, but it's defended by the knight in the corner. And now the pawn is taken in the center. So this is a good central knight defended by the bishop. This bishop is also very strong, putting a lot of pressure along this diagonal with this rook also attacking. So this b7 square is very vulnerable right now. But the knight is attacked twice. And he decides to attack the knight with his rook instead of defending his piece. That's something that grandmasters often do, is they are able to see, okay, I can play this move to attack another piece, even though my piece is attacked. And it doesn't always work for amateurs. Like often they'll have a move that consolidates their position and attacks something that you have. And so it's important to just see all the intricacies of the position. So here, these pieces they're all right. They're better than the. Are they better than the bishops? I love the bishop pair, I have to admit. So now this bishop becomes active and may be able to take down here, which could be good. The knight comes towards the center and now attacks the rook again. The bishop is attacked, but the bishop can move. The bishop is pretty good on this diagonal, but it's attacked by the pawn. It may run out of squares. It may become traded. Yeah, it looks like it could become traded. It looks like it's trapped now. And then the bishop moves here to attack the knight. And this is a little bit complicated. Cheburator is pretty low on time, so Gleish is up on time in this position. He could win if he is able to play fast. So here in this position, yeah, bishop takes here, and now he takes here, but then he takes here, and now goes here in order to try to set up a checkmating pattern after f6. So he plays pawn up in order to try to defend against the checkmate, I suppose. The bishop retreats. I don't know if that's the right retreat. Now pawn up. It looks like this could be a checkmating position. Oh, he needs to be able to defend against the rook to c7. So he goes here. And this he can't take with the rook because then there's check and then mate in this corner. And black forfeits on time. So Cheburator was way down on time, down like over 10 seconds, but he caught up with some trickiness. All right, we got another game. So Cheburator is playing Khans, and we see a c5 move. The knight is centralized. The queenside castling. The queen comes to the center. Bishop goes to e6. There's some attacking a2. The queen is active on a5, attacking a lot of squares. h5 is played, and a3 is played. That's kind of unusual. We may see a b5, b4 to try to break. He tries to exchange the queens. I think purple's position is pretty decent here. He may retreat the queen, go for some sort of checkmate attack. He decides to move it to c5, which is kind of interesting. That way the rook can take back, and the rook is pretty active on c5. Knight retreats prophylactically. b5 as I predicted, and now the bishop comes to c4, so we'll see some exchanges, I think. The knight decides to retreat. The knight could be coming to this square. That would be a good square. So the bishop retreats prophylactically. In bullet, it's really good to play things prophylactically. Play them, the move before you have to, because people are pre-moving. The games are so fast. You don't really have time to react to your opponent's move. You have time to react to the move before your last opponent's move. So this square is now weak. Knight there would be awesome, but there's this pawn. I wonder if b3 almost could have worked, but not really. So he pushes the pawn. Defended by the bishop. So the bishop is pretty good in this position. But, the knight's pretty good, too. The knight could be coming to e6. The rooks are starting to become active. We have 25 against 22 seconds. But now this may open the c-file, which could be devastating. He does open the c-file. Now, we have all sorts of options for double checks. The rooks are the rooks are doubled, and this could be good. But the king is able to move out off the line. And this knight is pretty good on this position. The bishop is, not doing very much. He could take that, could become a passed pawn, which could be good. He decides to defend the knight instead, then the bishop retreats. The king is active in the participation, and now this pawn falls, and he checks. He could take, and then, no, he can't take here because it's still defended by the knight. This knight is pretty good in this position, better than the bishop, considering that the pawns are both on light squares. So he takes here, and the knight moves again. He checks. He grabs the knight, which is good, but then the pawn is queening, and white runs out of time. Good game, good game. All right, we got another game. Grandmaster Cheburator against Hellbent, and Cheburator is just demolishing his opponents, I think. We saw a 1g4, a Grob type position, and so, I don't know, it's kind of funny, like, the Grob 1g4, it weakens some key squares in White's position, but it's also just kind of fun. Sometimes it can catch people off guard, but it didn't really seem to catch Cheburator off guard, whose name is, he said that his name is, he named himself partly after the Terminator, is what his profile said. So the knight takes here. Knight attacks the queen. He takes the rook, and then after the queen takes, the bishop takes. So that is a material advantage for Cheburator, the purple player. B5 is played immediately. I like this move, just playing it instantly, attacking the knight, gaining some space, opening up a little bit of lines for the rook. Opening up lines is going to favor the player who has more material. It's going to be more obvious that you have an advantage when you have more stuff on the board, basically, when you can use more of your pieces. So the bishop comes to attack the rook moves up, the bishop attacks again, and now he pushes. So this pawn is pretty strong. He'll have to basically exchange everything, and then there'll be a knight remaining if he wants to get rid of this pawn, which he just can't do. Can't afford. The knight checks. The king moves again. This position is pretty dominating. The knight moves, and then there's another check exchange, and then so now in this position he's up a bishop. And the rook falls. That's game. Takes, and it's just over. Takes. It's too easy. All right, he gives up. He quits, actually. He just disconnects. All right, we got another game, and Cheburator has broken 2400. He is at 2401, and now he's playing an even stronger player, Grandmaster Barty, who seems pretty good. And so pawn plays up. There's a queenside castling. Pretty good position for purple here. Pretty good control of the center. Decides to move the pawn again and then move out his knight. We see that white is starting to expand on the queenside. He hasn't decided where he's going to castle his king. The rook takes back, and then the pawn goes all the way up. Kind of interesting. So now if the knight moves, it'll be attacking the rook. The bishop decides to retreat because this is a pretty good knight here. There's a queenside castling. The knight moves. The rook decides to sacrifice for the knight, which is pretty interesting. He did it basically instantly. Now there's takes, and now the bishop retreats. This bishop could become a good bishop. That's what he has. He sacrificed the rook for the bishop, I believe. Or no, I guess the knight took... No, anyway, this bishop pins it, and then the rook comes down, threatening to go to this square. That would be a pretty good square. So the bishop has to go here. And now pawn up. That wins a piece. That wins material back. That's good. So white's sacrifice has paid off, I believe. He goes here. Oh, there's a pin. Look at this pin. Rook pinned on the queen. That's pretty awesome. So he can't take, so he has to take this way. And now the queen falls. That's pretty dominating. Queen comes here. There could be some discoveries, but here's check on the king. Check again. And the queen on the open board is just too good, and the game is over. All right, we got a rematch. So this is a pretty top-level action here. The pawn goes up. This is sort of a perk defense. A 4-pawns attack. Barty is just pissed. He's going all in situation. It's a pre-flop. You got ace king and you just shove. That's the kind of thing that he's doing here. But the queens are traded. So actually he's not totally going all in. He's willing to play without the queens, not going directly for the king. But here's a pawn up, and the knight is forced to retreat. This knight comes forward, attacking the bishop. This knight comes out, finishing his development. But look at these weak squares, and the bishop decides to exchange, which I think is kind of, I don't know, I didn't quite expect that. The rook decides to retreat. The king comes up. Now, these rooks are, both sides of rooks are connected. This pawn is one of the weaknesses in the position. 3 pawn islands for purple and 2 pawn islands for white. The rooks are exchanged. White thinks that he could win with the minor piece endgame. It seems like that's why he traded off the rooks, traded off the queens, things like that. We will see if that's the case. Here's another exchange, and this pawn is a little bit weak. The knight decides to retreat. There's another check. The knight may be coming forward. I wonder where this knight... Okay, so the knight attacks the pawn, forcing pawn up, and then there's a takes and an exchange. This endgame, who does it favor? Well, it looks like this bishop is actually trapped, right? This bishop has like literally nothing that it can do. Yeah, this bishop is trapped in this base. So normally you don't want the bishop that is the same color as your pawns. But in this situation, it's good because the bishop is literally trapped in this structure. But it looks like this is definitely a draw, and they decide to draw the game. All right, we see a rematch, which I'm pretty excited about. And we will see... I think Cheburator is going to play the King's Indian setup again, a quick kingside castling, and then a breakthrough in the center. He decides to play c3, b4, expanding. There's a queenside castle, so this is pretty fast expansion on the queenside. He'll be able to attack the knight pretty soon. He plays a5, b6, just break it through immediately. The knight takes back, but there are some open lines on this side of the board, which could be exploited. The knight comes forward, and he's down a pawn, but at the same time, he could get a good attack. He moves to c5. Did he take anything on c5, or was that a blunder? He plays forward. There was no exchange. Oh, there's pin. There's a pin. So this pawn can't take anything on c5 because there's a pin on the king, which is part of the reason for the sacrifice. You want to create pins and things like that. So he plays c4, trying to open up this bishop diagonal, which could be devastating. Pawn takes, and then pawn up attacks the knight. The knight's going to be forced to retreat, I believe. The knight does retreat. This knight comes forward to the center. And the queen takes here. He decides to play pawn up. He could have just... Oh, no, he couldn't have trapped the queen because the king is on this diagonal. I thought for a second that the king was on the c-file. Try to trade queens, which I think really makes a lot of sense in this position. He does trade queens successfully, and now the knight comes forward. So we see that white is down in some material in this game. White just... White, it looks like he hung a rook, but actually he has checkmate if he can go to this square. That's awesome. And so now he attacks the knight. There's another check, and then he wins the rook through with that tactic. So that was an excellent tactic. I really like it. Pawn up, and now he takes here because if pawn takes, then rook takes knight. And this is basically just devastating. Cheburator wins the game. Boom! Rematch! So we see d4, e4 played, and another sort of funky hyper-modern setup. We were going to see a b5 played. That's why a4 was played. Now we see an expansion on this side with g4 and h3. We see exchange in the center. The knight is powerful in the center. This bishop could be good. There's some weaknesses on the dark squares in white's position, but he plays f4. White's going for the attack. Purple plays queen a5. The queen influences a lot of squares and is pretty safe on a5, which is often why you see that in these types of Sicilian positions. So bishop f3 is played here, and b5 is played, trying to gain some space, and he's going to try to play push, kick the knight, and then play bishop b5. But first, this pawn is pushed up, attacking the knight retreats, and then the bishops are exchanged. The king comes up, the queen checks, and then it retreats. The bishop comes here, attacking some squares, but here comes this play. B4, the knight is forced to come forward. You basically always need the knight to come forward. If it goes backwards, it's too passive. The queens are exchanged. The rook did take a pawn on this square, and so we see 5 pawns against 5 pawns. So it is equal in this position, but there's some serious pawn islands, and I think that purple's king is a little bit weak, but this pawn is taken, which is good. This is a passed pawn, so that could be advantageous. We're going to see an attack on purple king versus trying to push this pawn. Pawn up, check, and takes. That's going to hurt the white attack, definitely. White has very little attack at this point because that pawn has fallen. He decides to move his rook again. Now he's just going to try to take this pawn. He knows that if this is attacked, he can just push it because it's defended by the knight. So the knight is pretty active in this position, doing some key things. The rook is defending this pawn, and now this rook is going to be activated. Here comes a check and another check. And the rook comes up attacking the bishop, and he can start to push this pawn. So this looks like a good position for Cheburator. He's way up on time as well. And he is just outplaying Barty. I think he's won every game so far. Decides to retreat, so now this pawn could fall, but the game ends on time with purple having the better position. We see another game, Cheburator against Hellbent. So Cheburator playing a little bit of a weaker opponent in this game. There's an exchange made. This is sort of an unusual setup that Cheburator likes to play, but he knows how to play it, and he plays it pretty fast, and so it's just fine. So pawn takes, pawn up, and we see that, I don't know what's going on in this position. It looks like the knight could be coming to f4. It does come to f4. The knight comes over to try to exchange that knight because this knight is pretty powerful. The knight retreats, and there's a central break. Rook comes over, queen's... The knight exchange, the queen comes up. This square is a little bit weak. I think that, yeah, he does take it. There's a pin, but at the same time, the queen moves out of the pin. It's overprotected. There could be exchanges here, and then a check here, and a check down here. That's what we see. So this is pretty good. The queen is going to retreat, and now the pawn is taken. So purple has won a pawn, but at the same time, yeah, white wins the pawn back immediately. Queen comes here basically to defend this pawn. He does have some check threats. Cheburator sees that he could push this pawn to create some threats on the opponent's king, which I really like. I think that's a good idea. There are some threats on f2, and now he's going to take here with check, king back, and this is mate. Hey everybody, Portland Chess Shop here to bring you some more bullet chess action, and we have Grandmaster Dark Ocean against Tourist. Dark Ocean's name, I think, is Anton Korobov or something of the sort. Anton Korobov, 24 years, FIDE 2671. So he is playing Tourist. We're going to be following Dark Ocean. He's a Grandmaster from Russia, and Tourist is from Italy. Dark Ocean is the favorite in this game. We see some pawns on the light squares for white. This knight is pretty powerful over here, and black is actually expanding on the king side, even though his king is on the white king is on the opposite side, on the queen side, and white decides to expand on the queen side as well. So it's kind of interesting. We see people expanding on the side that their king is at, which is a little bit abnormal. So pawns move out here to try to kick this knight. The other pawn goes up forward. We see, I think Dark Ocean plays with sort of an unusual style, which is pretty interesting, pretty exciting. The knight comes forward in order to keep the queen from attacking the knight on b3. The bishop controls this square. This square is controlled pretty well, the c6 square. The knight decides to retreat and now come forward, attacking these two important squares. And the rook decides that it needs to sacrifice in order to defend both those squares simultaneously. These knights are not doing very much. The knight actually had to retreat from the b3 square because it just didn't have any more entry squares. It's too far in the corner. Didn't have any ways to attack. Here he's trying to make a breakthrough. We see that Tourist is basically out of time, meaning that Dark Ocean, with his unusual play, was able to, I wouldn't say swindle, but just play much faster, play moves that his opponent didn't predict. Here he's going to take the knight for free, and that is just about game. 5 seconds versus 18 seconds, but this pawn is falling. He's up a rook, and the game ends.